Hello guys, this is your friend and we are back with a new fanfic. What if Naruto raised the empire and he was the unwanted fox part 2? And if you enjoy this fanfic then please press the like button and subscribe to my channel for more fanfic like this. And now let's start the fanfic. Yay, chapter 3. Okay, small thing, I kind of wrote these first 3 back to back in 2 days so I could put them out one after another. I hope you are enjoying it and that this has helped your reading experience. I hope some people have followed, favorite and reviewed, and to those who have I say thank you from the past. Well, Empire backstory out of the way, yay, now we get into the major conflict of the story. We have an empire, but what could we set them against? I hope you enjoy what I do here. Also, a few people will be showing up soon, but they will be explained, so please be patient. Also, a new OC appears here and their armor is based off of the stuff from the Alexander from Code Geass. I think you'll know who when you see them. Also have made my choice and yes, it will be a single pairing with Hinata. For those of you who are angry, well, write your own story where she isn't the pairing, all power to you. I like how the Code Geass characters are working as friends instead of pairings and I want to keep it that way, so I will. However, I'll give you an inch here. There are 2 women available for pairing. Cornelia and Euphemia. Send out suggestions if you can think of anyone to pair them with. At the moment I already have a plan for Nunnally. Also, in case you were wondering, Naruto, Colin, and Lelouch at the end of the last chapter were 16 years of age. Making Cornelia something like 23 with Euphemia being 17 and Cece now pushing into her later 30s. Hope that helps things. Also, someone brought up a point I felt I should address. With Jiraiya and the Toads, no, the Toads are ignorant here, and Jiraiya pulled the summoning once he told the Toads his story, as let's face it, he had all the proof he needed to convince them, and the child of prophecy is vague enough to be anyone, so yeah, no problem there. If you see this as a cop-out, well, sorry, but it comes with the territory of a fanfiction. Anyway, thanks for reading and enjoy. Chapter 3. Talking. Thinking, mental conversation. Demon, God or the like, printed words. Jutsu. Rising tensions over the Great Divide. 2 years since the rise of the United Empire. You know, I almost prefer the war to this, muttered a blond man as he leaned back in his chair looking over to see a dog-sized kitsune laying across from him, giving him a bored look before opening its jaw in a wide yawn. Sorry, what was that? Sounded like more whining, smirked Kurama as Naruto sighed, setting down his pen, idly cracking his neck as he did. Yeah, I get it, muttered Naruto as he pushed himself up from his desk, allowing the light from the window behind him to drop over his white uniform, a cross between military garb and a robe with a deep burnt crimson that reached down to his feet. The mix of black and crimson gave him an intimidating appearance that stopped at his whiskered face that held the same compassion he had known as a child upon it. I'm going to take a break, okay? A few clones can handle the rest from here, called Naruto as a few puff of smoke announced his copy's arrivals that moved over to handle the last bits of the addendum. Looking around, Naruto's eyes moved over the wide window that looked out into the courtyard, spying a few figures below moving around the garden, a smile coming to his lips as he saw a few children rush by. Looks like Euphemia let the local children into the gardens again. Eve's going to have a fit if they mess of Wally's work. Chuckled the boy to himself as he moved out of the office and into the carpeted halls, Kurama trotting along behind him, chuckling to himself. When is she not having a fit? I swear, for someone with so few emotions she sure has mastered anger. Replied the fox as Naruto nodded. I suppose, replied the blonde as the pair turned down another corridor, passing a few armored guards who snapped off a salute that Naruto returned with a smile that the guards returned. My emperor, Lady Euphemia has. He started as Naruto waved him off. Invited every child she could to play in the gardens, I saw. I swear we need to find her a husband before she starts kidnapping kids for herself. Chuckled Naruto as the guards smiled, nodding as the emperor continued on down the passage, descending down a wide circular staircase until he found himself at the entrance to the gardens, just in time to see a few children rush by, followed by a laughing Euphemia. And there she goes, called Naruto as a figure stepped into his line of sight a few yards away, drawing the blonde's attention. The figure was around Nunnally's age, dressed in what could only be described as a gardener's uniform, consisting of baggy brown overalls that was combined with a bright green shirt that showed a few touches of dirt. As Naruto turned to face him, the figure turned to him, his red eyes focusing on Naruto for a moment before his face broke into a wide grin, his arm rising above his brown bangs, in a happy wave that Naruto returned, smiling softly, moving over as he did. "Well, Wally, how's the garden?" asked Naruto, smiling as the boy smiled happily, waving a hand gently around as every flower opened as if a one mind. From around the pair, the excited cries of children rose as they rushed around in the blooming garden, bringing a smile to Wally's face as he turned back to Naruto, nodding happily. "I see. Wonderful as ever. You really have a gift, you know that," smiled Naruto as the brown-haired boy nodded excitedly as another presence drew his eyes around as another figure approached. She was almost the direct opposite of Wally in every way possible, her form pristine white, right to her hair, while her blue eyes flashed as she focused them on Naruto, the wind catching her hair and blowing it gently over the white armor she insisting on wearing, as well as the holsters strapped to her waist. "Hello, Eve, you look well," smiled Naruto as the woman nodded to him, moving over to stand close to Wally. "Yes, Emperor, I am well," replied the girl in a voice that was almost devoid of any emotion. "Just thought I would compliment Wally's work. Thank you again for looking after him," replied the blonde as the white-haired woman shook her head slightly. "There is no need for thanks, Emperor. I would do it without the request," replied the woman as beside her Wally gave her a smile, moving over to take her hand in his even as his lips parted. Eva," he managed, drawing the woman's eyes around to him as he gestured towards the garden, starting to move off, the woman following behind. As they moved away, Naruto's eyes fell upon the scar running across Wally's throat for a moment before he shook himself of the image. "It's not your fault he was experimented on. Those were the times back then with chakra users here. Just be glad that his guard cared more for him than she did for her lord," commented Kurama as Naruto let out a breath, nodding as he watched the brown-haired boy wave a hand as a brilliant blue rose emerged from a bush, quickly finding its way into Eve's hair, causing the smallest hint of red to touch her cheeks as Wally smiled at her. "Yeah, you're right. Besides, I have enough to worry about," replied Naruto as the two made their way past the gardens. As they rounded the grounds, a call drew their attention around as Lelouch approached in his formal robes, a few figures Naruto recognized as his council beside him. "Lelouch," greeted Naruto was his friend moved over, giving him a small smirk. "Dodging work again, Emperor," replied the man as Naruto gave a grin. "Never. So what can I do for you?" asked the Emperor as the two made their way forwards, the council following behind at a small distance to give the two some privacy. "I just received a report from our first ambassador to the east. It seems that what we heard was true. The nations are still united after that conflict a year ago," spoke Lelouch as Naruto nodded. "I'm actually impressed. One would think that without a common enemy they would have already turned on one another," replied Naruto as Lelouch nodded. "One would think, but I guess some things last longer than you would expect. But apart from that, our ambassador reported he couldn't get a meeting with any of the daimyos. Seems they didn't believe the West was actually united," continued Lelouch as Naruto nodded. "Now that I believe, I suppose it was too much to hope they would take our word for it, so what does that leave us? Opening up trade to the east means we have to have some recognition?" asked the blonde as Lelouch gave a small smile. "Well, proof obviously. It just so happens a tournament for the anniversary of their victory is being held in a few months, and it is open to anyone," finished the purple eyes man, giving a wicked smile. "You know you look evil when you smile like that," remarked Naruto as Lelouch shrugged. "I suppose, Kami knows Colin tells me as much daily," muttered the man, drawing a small smile from Naruto. "So who do you suggest we send?" asked Naruto as the two continued around the corner discussing their plans for the upcoming tournament. At the same time across the world inside the land of fire another blonde figure was having much the same discussion with a group of figures. Within the Hokage's office sat Tsunade behind her large wooden desk piled high with scrolls, her eyes looking across to the group before her as she let out a small sigh. Are you sure you won't reconsider? This tournament is to honor everyone who fought and died in the war. We only managed to defeat Akatsuki thanks to everyone's aid. It would do help the village greatly if you would agree to go and represent us, spoke the woman, her brown eyes looking between the pair that stood before her. Except neither of us care to represent this place, Tsunade, and you know very well why. Spoke the first figure, a tall blonde man sporting sapphire blue eyes. Beside him the other gave a small nod, gently adjusting the child in her arms that was even then reaching playfully at a strand of her crimson hair. Enough, Tsunade. You know damn well what our answer was before you asked, so what's this about? Asked the redhead as Tsunade turned her brown eyes to meet the woman's violet ones, letting out a sigh as she did. You're right, Kushina, I'm sorry. It was a request from the council, and don't worry, they can't force either of you to go. Replied Tsunade as across from her Minato and Kushina Namikaze nodded. Good. Maybe if you'd had that attitude a few years ago you'd have more of our support. Snapped Kushina as beside her Minato sighed, laying a hand on the woman's shoulder as he saw Tsunade flinch away from the redhead's words. Kushina-chan, whispered Minato as the redhead looked to him before allowing her anger to slip from her, turning slowly back to Tsunade even as the bundle in her arms let out a small happy gurgle. Sorry Tsunade, that wasn't fair. Whispered Kushina as the Hokage shook her head. No, it was Kushina. Just forget it, replied Tsunade as she looked back at the two who stood before her in defiance of death itself. It was still almost impossible to believe that it had happened. As the elemental nations had united to face off against the Akatsuki's forces, the Edo tents had been flinging the dead back at the united shinobi forces from the beginning to the end. Among them had been the fourth Hokage and his wife, both of whom had arrived near the end, luckily only resulting in limited damage. Then when they had pushed the leaders of Akatsuki all the way back, that falling out had happened, some orange-masked guy going for the red-haired one, and that paper user taking the strike instead. After that all hell had broken loose as the orange-haired figures had rushed the masked man, practically tearing him to pieces before the red-haired man pulled out some kind of jutsu they still couldn't understand. All over the battlefield the injured and dead alike had suddenly arrived, hearts beginning to beat again after they had stopped forever, and possibly most shocking is the remaining revived fighters letting out howls as they were stripped of their immortality, their bodies returning to life, dropping them back into the world they had long departed. Among them had been the pair that stood before her now. At first it had been like a dream, the dead returning to life, but as the fighting ended Tsunade was faced with the horror of explaining to the parents that their son, Naruto was missing. It hadn't taken the parents long to get the truth out of the Hokage, horrified at the village's actions, and that they had driven their son to become a traitor. It had taken everything that Tsunade had to just keep the pair from killing the rest of the clan heads for their actions. Some had even foolishly believed that Minato would take back his stance as the Hokage. Those hadn't lived very long. The pair had moved into a small home on the outside of the village. At first they had considered leaving, but even they knew that there was really nowhere to go, and the best chance of finding their son came with staying in the village. They had become mostly reclusive, only speaking to a select few, and accepting work only on their terms as they continued to search for any trace of their son to give him the home he had deserved to have. The one bright spot being the birth of their son a year before the little blonde boy had become their world, even as they searched for his brother. Across from the pair Tsunade sighed as she shuffled a few papers on her desk, offering a small smile as the violet eyes of Menma peeked up above the bundle, letting out a small happy cry at seeing her. Well then, now that I have your answer, I suppose I just have to ask if you want to come to the tournament with me. Get out of the village for a time? Asked Tsunade as the pair looked at one another for a few moments before both smiled. Hi Tsunade, that sounds nice. Replied Minato as Tsunade nodded. I'll make sure to give you the information, for now I have to get back to picking our representative. Replied the woman, watching as the three disappeared in a flash of yellow light, leaving the woman alone once again as she looked down to a photo showing a smiling blonde boy waving happily up at her. You better be out there, Gaki, whispered Tsunade as a few flecks of moisture dropped from her eyes. It had been almost 6 years now and not even a whisper had been heard of the boy. Most wrote him off as falling to the Akatsuki at some point, while others said he died in Odo during the war, when the Akatsuki had destroyed the traitor Orochimaru, but for some reason Tsunade just couldn't accept that. Something told her that he was alive, somewhere. Meanwhile, a few weeks later in the Western Empire, Naruto was seated across from 4 figures, idly rubbing his head as he went through the subject for what felt like the 100th time. Look, they aren't going for a vacation, they are going to represent our empire so we can hopefully have some kind of positive relation with the Eastern world, spoke Naruto as he looked across to where Nunnally and Wally sat, both nodding. We understand, Naruto-kun, but if even Colin are going to participate in the tournament, then we want to go to cheer them on, spoke Nunnally as beside her the brown-haired boy nodded in agreement, causing Naruto to sigh as he looked over to Colin and Eve for help. Unfortunately for the young lord, he found none waiting for him. What's the big deal? You yourself will be there, so the more people you can trust present the better, right? Asked Colin as Eve gave a small nod. Where I go, Wally goes, spoke the white-haired woman matter-of-factly as she looked at the Emperor. Naruto allowed his eye to drift between the 4 before him for a few more moments before he raised his hands in surrender. Okay, you win. But you do realize that leaves Lelouch and CC in charge of this country. I'm worried Cornelia and Euphemia won't be able to keep them in line. After all, they're headed to oversee the forward bases during this time, smirked Naruto as Colin waved a hand dismissively. Oh, relax, he won't pull anything, chuckled Colin as beside her Nunnally nodded as beside her Kurama raised his head up looking around. Besides, Kurama-kun can look after them, smiled the blonde girl as the fox gave a small smirk that caused Naruto to shiver. Oh, I feel some much better, grumbled the man as the rest of the group chuckled at his reaction. Not long after, found Naruto standing before an airship like the ones he had seen once in his travels to Snow. Turns out that most of the stuff that guy had been using was bought from the West. In hindsight, he supposed that was reasonable. After all, it always did strike him as odd that something like chakra armor just sprung up in the East and then wasn't heard from again. Shrugging to himself, Naruto turned to CCC, watching him, dressed in a simple white dress, idly eating a piece of that baked cheese bread she seemed to enjoy so much. Come to see me off? Asked Naruto, looking around at the woman, who gave a small shrug before she pulled out his red helm from behind her back, tossing it into the blonde's hands, causing him to look down at it before turning back to her. You can fool the others, but I know you're worried about going to the East. Just keep your face covered and tell them to keep your name quiet. Remember that you aren't that boy I picked up from the sands anymore, you're our emperor, so act like it. Called CC as Naruto gave a small smile, pulling the helm into place as he nodded towards his sister figure. Thanks, and don't worry, I'll do what's right for my country no matter what. called Naruto as the green-haired woman nodded, giving him a parting wave as she turned back from the airfield, leaving Naruto to look back towards the ship, his mind moving slowly over his times in the East once again. Ever since he'd agreed to go through with this plan, he'd been thinking about the East, about his first home. I wonder what's become of everyone. No, I suppose it doesn't matter. Cece's right, I'm not that boy anymore. Besides, it's not like I have anyone that would miss me. Well, aside from Granny, I suppose Shino and Hinata might, but they probably believe whatever story Jiraiya made to cover up his attack. Still, it would be good to see some old friends. I wonder how Gaara's doing. I guess I'll just have to see what life has in store for me, like always. Finished Naruto, his thoughts drawing to an end as the signal for departure rang out, causing him to turn back towards the ship, moving forwards as his robes waved behind him along with his foxtail plume. Soon enough, Emperor was aboard and the ship was off, sailing through the skies towards the elemental nations. At the same time, across the world, a group was moving out of Konoha as well, headed for Suna, where the competition would be held this year. At the head was Tsunade, followed after by the Namakazes as well as the Rookie Nine, along with Team Guy and their senseis, the youths having grown into their skills during the war, and now representing the best that the village had to offer. It had been quite the shock for them when they first learned of the truth behind Naruto's parentage, but in the end it had done little for them. In their eyes, Naruto was what he had been before, a traitor to the leaf, and to them. Only one of the group still fully believed in Naruto's innocence, the same girl who had learned to believe in the impossible that the boy represented when he was just a brave child that refused to leave her to be bullied by some boys in a park. Hinata Hyuga had grown over the course of the conflict, but since Naruto had left the village, she had slowly drifted from the rest of the Rookie Nine as well as her own family, as Neji returned to his old ways after Naruto's betrayal. His memory view shifting to anger that despite everything, Naruto had not been willing to make the same sacrifice his father had for other, casting him as a coward in the boy's eyes. So in solitude, Hinata had continued to hope that her first love was safe wherever he was. As she had moved steadily from her team, and as the suspicions on Naruto shifted from worries and whispers to fact, the pale-eyed girl found herself truly alone. Her only solace had come with the return of the Namakazes. The parents had grown close to Hinata as she told them of the amazing boy that their son had been, without the stigma of the village, or the belittlement that came from the shinobi and his instructors. Even Kakashi had not been immune to this, expressing his sorrow for his sensei's loss, but making it clear that Naruto's betrayal was inexcusable all the same. That particular comment had landed the man in the hospital, and he had not dared to stay in Kushina's presence for more time than absolutely necessary since then. So as the group set off for Suna, Hinata found herself looking out across the village, wondering if this time she might find even a hint of her blonde hero's whereabouts. A few days later found the forces of Konoha arriving at the gates of Suna before being cleared to enter the village, more than one glancing around at the massive coliseum constructed outside the walls for the competition, as well as something else that stuck out among the sandy dunes. "Hey, isn't that Dodo's ship?" called Sakura, pointing towards where a massive airship sat, its sides covered in layers of white sheets embroidered with a curious symbol that looked like some kind of red bird flying off into a sunset. As the rest turned towards what Sakura indicated, a huff from her left drew her eyes around to where Sasuke stood in his Anbu age, having shaped him over the years, though he kept the same distinguishing features. "Hi, that looks the same, but I don't recognize the symbol," remarked the Uchiha as the rest nodded in agreement before a voice belonging to Asuna Chunin spoke up. "Yeah, none of us knew what to make of it. Some people claiming to be from the United West showed up in it for the tournament. They were dressed in armor like some kind of samurai too. Weird if you ask me," remarked the man as the rest looked at one another. I heard that someone claiming to be from the West came to see the fire daimyo some weeks back, but that's ridiculous. The West hasn't been around since the first shinobi war in the village of the skies, remarked Tsunade as beside her Kushina gave her a look of comprehension. Wait, Sky, weren't they the ones who tried to take over the entire elemental nations? Asked the redhead as beside her Minato nodded. Hi, that was them, but they were wiped out a century ago. Nothing's been heard from them since. What are they doing here now? Muttered Minato as he moved slightly closer to Kushina. From behind them the remaining Konoha forces gave the ship a final distant look before allowing themselves to filter into the village. Meanwhile inside the village Naruto, his armored helm sitting upon his brow, walked beside Colin as the redhead pushed Nunnally forwards through the streets, Wally and Eve deciding to stay on the ship for the time being while the others moved about the village. This place really is different, I mean, it's practically bleeding chakra. Commented Colin looking around in wonder as Nunnally nodding in agreement as they saw a pair of Kiri shinobi pass them by, giving the three a small glance before moving on without comment. Hi, this is just one of the villages. Here in the east there are 5 major ones, and a few smaller ones, but they are all a little alike. Remarked Naruto as the two women nodded. The group had arrived only a day before, causing a small stir as the ship sat down, Gaara himself arriving to greet them. Naruto had almost blown his cover at seeing his old friend having achieved his dream, but held it in playing the part of an emperor first and explaining their arrival. After a small discussion, Gaara had welcomed them, and at this moment they were on their way to meet with him in order to discuss possible trade with the Wind Daimyo. Soon enough the three had arrived at the Cage's building, being welcomed in and led quickly to his office. As their guide was about to knock announcing their arrival, a small smattering of voices caused her to halt as the three from the west also paused, looking over to the door a moment before it swung open. Thank you Cage-san, we will go and get settled, thank you for your time. Spoke Tsunade as she turned to leave Shizune as well as the Namakazes and Hinata beside her. As the Konoha group turned they came face to face with the delegation from the west, both groups pausing but for different reasons. On the journey Naruto had explained to the forces of his past in greater detail. Colin and Nunnally had of course already known, but above all he stressed the importance of avoiding Konoha if at all possible, and here they had practically run over them. On the other side the Konoha forces looked ahead, their eyes moving from the armored form of Colin, only missing her gauntlets and helm to be complete, over towards the armored helm of Naruto, and finally to the chair-bound Nunnally in her simply yellow dress. Oddly enough it wasn't the armored pair that drew their attention but rather the chair-bound girl, who was even to the least sensitive sensor practically dripping with chakra that would put some cages to shame. For a tense moment the two sides watched one another until of all things the little bundle that was Menma gave a happy squeal, waving his hands towards the three, giggling happily, drawing everyone's eyes. Menma-kun, whispered Kushina, shifting her hold on the child, attempting to quiet him as across from them Nunnally let out a small smile, nodding to the group. We apologize, we were not aware the cage was occupied. Spoke Nunnally with the mannerisms of a true lady of the court. Her words seemed to snap Tsunade out of her rut as she turned to the chair-bound girl, offering a smile of her own. No need, we were just finishing, replied the blonde as she looked across the three again before continuing. I am Tsunade Senju, Hokage of Konoha, and these are my companions Kushina, Minato, Hinata, and Shizune. Spoke the blonde before a small giggle caused her to smile. Oh, and Menma-kun, finished the woman as the three nodded, Naruto's eyes hardly visible tracing over Tsunade's face, a small smile tracing his lips behind his helm as he saw her. That smile soon shifted, however, as his eyes turned to Hinata, as he felt his cheeks suddenly heat up at the sight of her. Years ago she had been a quiet but kind girl he had barely known. Now he was regretting it, as she had blossomed into a beautiful woman that stood before him in a simple cream-colored coat, her long indigo hair framing her soft face that still radiated that soft sense of acceptance he remember. Wait, what? Where did that come from? Wonder Naruto as he looked around to Shizune and then to the others, attempting to keep his mind occupied as he took in the pair of Minato and Kushina, both seeming somehow familiar, though for the life of him he couldn't understand why. Before he could contemplate more, he was drawn back to reality as Nunnally spoke again. It is a pleasure to meet you. May I introduce myself? I am Nunnally V. Britannia. This is my guard Colin, and the Emperor of the United West. Spoke the chair-bound girl, gesturing to the two beside her as the group turned their eyes to Naruto's helmed form, more than one a little shocked to hear who they were standing before. The United West? Asked Tsunade as the three before her nodded, Naruto moving slightly forwards to stand facing the woman he still thought of as family. Hi, it was hard fought, but our land is once again united. Spoke Naruto as the group from Konoha watched him for a few moments till the little form of Menma let out another giggle, gaining a warm chuckle from Naruto and his companions. It was a pleasure, Hokage-sama, but it appears one of your members needs some attention, and we would not detain you. I expect we shall see one another at the festivities. Spoke the blonde as Tsunade nodded, giving a small bow to them before departing, the rest of the group from Konoha following after as the three watched them depart before moving into the office. As the day of the tournament arrived, Colin and Eve found themselves standing on the arena floor among a sea of shinobi and samurai, all watching as the figures of the 5 cages began their speech on the great victory they had managed to seize years previously. As the speech began, Colin and Eve both found themselves losing interest in the talk, allowing their eyes to move out of the sunken arena, up the surrounding walls and into the stands, moving back and forth until they found the small balcony where Naruto, Wally and Nunnally sat beside a small guard, the younger two waving happily down at the two, drawing a smirk from Colin as beside her the barest trace of a smile touched Eve's lips. As the speeches finally drew to an end, the tournament began as shinobi and samurai clashed to the cheering to the crowd. As another fight began between a shinobi from Suna and a kunoichi Naruto vaguely recognized as Ino, he found his eyes once more shifting over to where he spied Hinata sitting beside the two Naruto had been introduced to the day before. Below the box, Hinata sat beside Kushina and Minato, little Menma now sitting on her lap, waving his little hands out, making happy cries as the people cheered. So Minato-kun, what do you make of those people from the west? Asked Kushina, looking around at her husband, who gave a small sigh, looking down towards where the waiting pairs stood, focusing for a moment as the white-haired one donned a smooth white helm emblazoned with twin blue jeweled eyes that seemed to almost glow, while she shifted what looked like a set of larger, oddly teardrop-shaped blades on either hips, both housing a hollow center that Minato could only guess at their purpose. I honestly couldn't say. From what I have seen, only the youngest had enough chakra to speak of, but there was something off about their armor. I could have sworn I've seen those symbols somewhere before, but I can't think of where for some reason. Replied Minato as Kushina nodded. What did they look like? Asked the redhead as Minato shrugged. I'd have to get a second look, but they were covering the joints of the armor on and that one the Emperor had them on his helmet. Remarked Minato as Hinata looked around, spotting the white-armored woman as she turned back to look up above them. Following her gaze, Hinata saw the booth above, spotting the figures of the Emperor looking down at her, before he shifted his gaze back to the arena, confusing the girl greatly. However, before she could remark on this, the battle ended with a draw as the next round was called. Below, Eve was signaled forwards, her form-fitting armor shining like a white beacon in the Suna sun as she moved forwards to stand across from a heavy-set shinobi that she remembered fitting the general description of an Akamichi that Naruto had informed her of. Superior strength and endurance, suffers from speed and precise attacks, victory uncertain. Muttered Eve as she moved to take her position. As she found her position, a voice reached her ears, causing her to turn her smooth helm up towards the source, seeing Wally waving happily down at her. Eva! Eva! called the happy boy, waving down at the armored figure that felt herself blushing lightly behind her helmet as she weakly raised a hand to wave back, causing the brown-haired boy to smile even wider, before she turned back to focus on her opponent. Reevaluation: defeat unacceptable, victory commencing, muttered the girl to herself as her hands moved down, gripping the handles of the two flat teardrop cylinders, pulling them free of their holsters, so that they lay upon her armored gauntlets, pointing both ahead, the outsides glinting thanks to their sharpened style. Across the arena, Choji felt himself shiver slightly at the blue glint coming from his opponent's helm as he steadied himself for what was coming. Above the arena, within the cage booth, the figures leaned forwards, getting a better look at the armored woman, more than one by now hearing about the supposed revival of the West, more than one wondering just what the ancient enemy of the element nations were going to show them. They didn't have to wait long as the signal went up, prompting Choji to spring forwards, his fist flying forwards and expanding as it rocketed towards Eve. As the massive fist neared her, Eve leapt above the arm, spinning in a graceful arc as her arms shot out the sharpened ends of her. The pair of teardrop cylinders attacked to her arms, swinging down, cutting furrows into Choji's expanded arm, drawing a cry of pain from the man as he stumbled back, his arm shrinking back as Eve landed, turning to face him. What? But Choji's expansion makes his skin like armor, called Asuma, looking around to the rest of Konoha, who looked just as shocked at the damage the boy had received from Eve's blades. Before they could question more, however, their eyes were drawn back as Choji leapt forwards, jerking himself around as his leg came swelling out, intent to catch Eve in its path of destruction. This time Eve did not move away, instead choosing to slam one bladed arm into the arena floor as she braced for the impact. From the stands, most of the arena looked on in pity at the figure, knowing that such a blow would likely break the woman despite her impressive armor. They were mistaken. As Choji's blow slammed into Eve, there was a sickening crack as the crowd watched the oversized leg bend and finally break around the armored figure that jerked but remained standing despite the devastating impact. As the shinobi's leg reverted back to its usual size, Eve stood, jerking her blade free of the arena floor as she moved over to stand above the crumpled boy, raising one hollow blade, pointing it into the boy's face as a commanding tone issued from her helm. Yield, called Eve as Choji looked down at himself before nodding, the stadium sitting in silence for a moment till a happy call issued from Wally, once again sparking a few rounds of applause from the civilians and shinobi as Eve moved back to the waiting area, the fellow contestants now giving her a wide berth. That was insane, whispered Kiba, looking around at his sensei, who nodded dumbly at what she had witnessed. How could she still be standing after that? It doesn't make any sense, asked Sakura, looking around at the others, who shook their head, not understanding what they had witnessed either. Above in the western booth, Wally was still clapping as beside him Nunnally smiled down at Eve's performance, casting a slightly worried look to the broken form of Choji before she felt a hand on her shoulder. He will be all right, Nunnally. Tsunade is a first-class medic, and he will recover in no time, whispered Naruto as Nunnally nodded at his words, looking back to the matches playing out below. As the day stretched on, the gathered patrons watched as Colin and Eve continued to battle their way through the ranks, some coming out better than others. Colin herself was finally forced to retire after a particularly harsh battle against a rapping oddball from Kumo, though she was at least satisfied that he hadn't walked away victorious from the fight either, having been blasted clear off the arena when she overloaded a storage seal to blast her remaining molten reserves into that odd cloak of chakra he had pulled out. Still, after that, Kalen's chakra reserves were well spent, and rather than showcase her hidden arsenal, Colin chose to bow out, leaving the rest to Eve. So as the tournament reached its finale, Naruto along with his fellows looked down as Eve moved into the arena. As she did, Naruto found himself flashing with barely contained anger as Sasuke stepped up across from her. Him, the one who had chosen to betray Konoha for power, now stood there, as people cheered him on. It turned out that after his failure to flee, Jiraiya had helped to train the youth alongside Kakashi, making him quite the hero during the war, as he slew his brother as well as a few other of the Akatsuki. And now he stood there being cheered on. Fortunately, Naruto was able to keep his anger in check as he turned his attention back to Eve, who nodded towards the western booth before focusing back on the Uchiha. You might as well surrender now. That armor of yours won't save you against me, called Sasuke, practically oozing confidence with every word as Eve turned her armored helm to face him. Just give up and save yourself the embarrassment. Run back to the west where you belong, continued the Uchiha, smirking at the silence Eve was offering, foolishly believing he was mentally weakening the girl. As he continued, Eve simply watched him, her arms shifting down to reattach her blades as she prepared for the battle to begin. After a few more shouts, the Uchiha seemed to realize his words were not having an effect as his eyes shifted to deep crimson, spinning slightly as he glared across at the white-armored figure. Hey, say something. What, are you deaf or just stupid like that cheering idiot of yours? Called Sasuke, finally getting a reaction as Eve's head snapped up to him, the blue eyes flashing as above in the booth. Even Naruto cringed at the Uchiha's choice of words. Oh, that's going to cost him, muttered the blonde as below the booth the Namakazes and Hinata were looking disgusted with Sasuke's words. What the heck is wrong with him? This is a tournament, not some private ego trip, muttered Kushina, privately disgusted at how far her friend's child had fallen, as beside her Minato shook his head. It's what comes of the village praising him without end. They've given him the idea he can get away with anything. What Jiraiya and Kakashi ever saw in him I will never know, spoke Minato, privately scowling as the names passed his lips. After their return and Jiraiya's story, Minato had cast the man out of his life, telling him simply that until Naruto was found, that Jiraiya better never show his face again if he wanted to remain among the living. It had only taken a single trip to the hospital to get the message across. Beside the pair, Hinata frowned slightly, nodding her head in agreement with the pair's words. Hi, and he doesn't seem likely to stop anytime soon. He's already believing himself to be some kind of hero, whispered the pale-eyed girl as she looked over to Eve, noticing the obvious protectiveness she seemed to have towards the boy that cheered above them. As Hinata thought of this, her own thoughts turned to another protective figure, her mind flashing to Naruto for a second as she looked out upon the arena. If only you were here, Naruto-kun, you could show them what a real hero was like. But why am I thinking about you now? Thought the pale-eyed girl as below the observer stepped back, preparing to begin the match. Across from Sasuke, Eve had gone stiff after his last words, her helm dropping down even as a smirk crossed the Uchiha's face. Finally found something that gets to you, huh? Well, don't worry, your stupid friend will get to watch me put you in your place, called Sasuke as Eve's blue eyes flashed, looking up slowly till they stared directly into the Uchiha's own. Just as the match began, Eve spoke a single sentence with such cold authority that it sent shivers down a few observers' spines. Target confirmed, whispered the white-armored woman as the call came. Without hesitating, Eve swung both her blades forward, blue seals suddenly exploding to life along their lengths as the hollow tubs of the blade crackled with sudden power. Sasuke only had a second to dodge as twin blasts of blue light shot forwards, cutting past him and crashing into the barrier around the arena with a grinding scream of light as the blasts ate through the first few layers, leaving the remaining seals glowing red with barely contained energy. In the cage booth, the Raikage, a hulking muscle beast of a man, sat up staring unbelievingly down at the arena. Storm release? That's impossible, whispered as most of the other looked on in wonder, seeing one of the rarest of bloodlines in play. Only Kushina and Minato recognized the truth below in the stands, both of their mouths dropping open as they suddenly recognized where they had seen those symbols before. Minato, those are, managed Kushina as beside her Minato nodded. Hi, seals, but there's no way. Seals like that have been lost since the time of the first Hokage, whispered the blonde as below Sasuke was rolling to a stop, his face contorted into a snarl as he drew a blade, rushing forwards at Eve. Without pausing, Eve turned to him, slamming her feet into the arena, firing off towards him with comparable speed, her blades twisting in a cross-like hold to catch his strike. With a flash of steel, the two blows met, sending sparks up as the two pushed against each other. As the two crossed blades with one another, Eve found herself giving slightly. Realizing this, the woman suddenly stepping back while spinning to send Sasuke past her, an armored leg shooting out to catch him in the back and flinging him forwards even as she leveled her teardrop cannons again, letting out another lance of destruction smaller than the first but at a greater speed, causing the Uchiha to dodge wildly to avoid the shimmering death. As he rolled to a landing, the Uchiha snapped out a few kunai, forcing Eve to pull her cannons back to cover her neck and eyes as the kunai glacé off her blade and armor alike. This gave Sasuke just enough time to fly through a set of seals as he spat out a blast of fire that caught the armored girl square in the chest. The smile that had begun to form on the Uchiha's face faltered, however, before it could fully form, as he saw his flame glacé off of the armor as another sea of blue seals shone to life along it, causing him to curse at the sight. Without pausing, Sasuke continued to fling fire, water, stone, lighting anything he could across the arena, only to watch as Eve's blades turned them asunder, all being felled by her blades. After a time, one shot finally passed through, slamming a pillar of stone into the armored figure, flinging her back. However, as the crowd watched, even that was not enough, the stone simply crumbling under the glow of more of those blue symbols as the White Maiden swung one blade around, scattering the stone before she rocketed forwards across the arena. "What the hell is this?" called Sasuke as Eve charged him again, swinging her blades forwards, one crashing into Sasuke's blade and sending it flying, even as the second thrust into his Anbu issued chest plate with enough force to lift him from the ground. Looking down, Sasuke saw as the seals started to glow anew, his body now held suspended by the deadly weapon. Eyes went wide around the stadium as the crowd saw the seals beginning to glow and heard the familiar hum of power, but before the blast could come, a voice called out, drawing Eve's head around. "Enough. The match is over. Eve is the winner now. Stop," called the judge, rushing forwards as Eve looked from him to Sasuke before allowing her blade to fall, dropping the Uchiha to the arena with an unceremonious crunch before stepping back, nodding to the judge. Most of the arena was completely silent at the sight before them as the crumpled form of Sasuke slowly pushed himself up, glaring as Eve slowly made her way back to the waiting area, as above them a few cheers run out. Struggling to stand, Sasuke's mind roared as he heard the cheers at his loss. His cheers, his. Sasuke's mind went red as she saw Eve moving away, his hand suddenly blazing to life with lightning chakra as he glared after Eve. Before anyone could even guess as to Sasuke's intentions, the boy was up, rushing towards Eve, his hand outstretched towards her, the crackling causing her to turn, too late to do more than watch as the lightning inked fist closed on her heart. There was a sudden sound like a cannon blast as the barrier around the arena shattered, sending chakra blasting back across the crowd, causing many to cover their eyes, leaving only a few to witness as the red armored figure crashed through the barrier, smashing into the arena, between the charging Uchiha and Eve, his gauntleted hand swinging around to catch the lightning inked fist. Sasuke's eyes shoot up to see the smooth mask of Naruto's crimson armor, its tail plume waving behind him even as chakra swirled around him, leaking around the groove in the armor as he held the Uchiha's attack in one gauntleted hand, eyes narrowed in disgust upon the man. "Not this time," growled Naruto, causing a look of confusion upon Sasuke's face a moment before it was replaced with a look of agony as his hand was crushed in Naruto's grasp with a sickening crunch that echoed around the arena. Sasuke let out a howl of pain as Naruto flung him back to roll across the ground to a stop, even as several figures rushed into the arena, many of them from Konoha, to surround Sasuke, a few openly surrounding Naruto and Eve, both of whom looked around seemingly bored at their presence. "Stand down," thundered a voice from above as those below looked up to see Tsunade rushing down, looking around at the Konoha forces, who shifted slightly before obeying, stepping back from the armored pair. "But Hokage-sama," they started Sakura before Tsunade silenced her with a glare. "Responded to an unprovoked attack by that fool," called Tsunade, glaring down at Sasuke before she turned her eyes around to where Naruto stood beside Eve, both turning to face her. "I am deeply sorry for the boy's actions. he does not represent the stance of our village. Started Tsunade as Naruto raised a hand for silence, which just so happening to be the bloody one he had just used to crush the Uchiha's own, before speaking. Regardless, your shinobi acted to murder one of my people after a fair contest of skill, Hokage-sama. Such an act deserved punishment. Called Naruto is over by Sasuke. The pink-haired Sakura growled, glaring over towards the armored pair. Punishment, you destroyed his hand. Yelled the girl as Naruto turned to face her, his tone forcibly calm, as he fought to keep his emotions in check at seeing the girl he had once had feelings for defending Sasuke even after his actions here. A hand he attempted to murder Eve with, I simply removed the weapon. Replied Naruto before turning back to Tsunade, pleased to see that she at least seemed to agree with him. I had hoped to begin negotiations with your daimyo as well, Hokage-sama. However, it would seem that if you are incapable of keeping your shinobi in check, I cannot trust my nation's future with you. Should this change, I will be willing to hear you, but do not bring this filth with you or you will find my door closed. Finished Naruto as Tsunade blinked a few times before nodding. I understand. Thank you, Emperor, for your understanding. If possible, I would like to speak with you on this matter before you depart. Replied the woman as Naruto turned to Eve before looking back to the booth above where he saw Nunnally and Colin standing with Wally watching him. Remember who you are. CC's words moving across his mind as he steadied himself, taking a few calming breaths before nodding to Tsunade. Very well, but it will be upon our ship. You may bring those we encountered earlier, they at least seem to possess manners. Finished Naruto as he turned Eve moving beside him as they marched back to the booth and their companions leaving the stunned stadium behind to look down at the leftovers of the incident. A few hours after the end of the tournament, with the announcement of Eve as the winner, those of Konoha found themselves gathered within the infirmary looking around as Sakura finished patching up the last of Sasuke's wounds, casting worried looks over the teen who only glared ahead, gritting his teeth in anger at his loss. Hokage-sama, why are you agreeing to meet with them after why they did to Sasuke? Called Kakashi looking over at his student as Tsunade turned to him with a disgusted look. Because Kakashi, unless it escaped you, your student just attempted to murder someone in full view of all of our allies and most of the known world. You're damn lucky I don't kill him myself for being such a fool, called Tsunade as Kakashi looked as though he wanted to speak only to fall silent at the look the blonde gave him. Be that as it may, Hokage-sama, they are obviously dangerous. Those seals around the arena were strong enough to hold a Jinchuriki in place, and that emperor of theirs broke through it without even slowing down. This seems too dangerous, spoke Asuma, taking a puff from a cigarette as beside him Shikamaru nodded. This whole thing is just odd, I mean the United West. They just show up out of nowhere and then practically decimate our best forces. I don't like this. The last time the Land of Sky moved, it was to attack our whole nation, muttered the teen as a few of his fellows nodded even as Tsunade turned to him. Whether you like it or not, this could be our one chance to fix what Sasuke just did. Finished Tsunade, turning to leave the room as Shizune moved to follow her. Hokage-sama, all started Kurenai before Tsunade shook her head back at the woman. You will say here. The only ones invited have already been spoken for. Remain here till I return, that goes for all of you. Called the blonde before she marched from the room, her assistant in tow, to where Minato, Kushina, Hinata and Menma were waiting for her. Meanwhile, outside of the village aboard their ship, Naruto was seated across from Nunnally and Colin, Eve already resting after having pushed herself to the limit on her last match, and Wally wanting to stay beside her. As Naruto raised his eyes to look across the simply metal table, he saw the small frown drawn across Nunnally's lips, drawing a sigh from his own as he leaned back in his chair. I'm sorry Nunnally, but there wasn't a peaceful way around that situation. In fact, from what I witnessed, it seems Lelouch's plan for recognition may have gotten us more than we wished for. Groaned Naruto, rubbing at his face as Colin sighed, looking up at the cabin roof as she did. Yeah, I mean, down in the arena all I got was suspicious looks at best. Heck, the only one to not outright glare at me was that rapping guy, and I'm pretty sure he was crazy. Weirdest thing too, some kept muttering about a sky village. Remarked Colin with a shrug. Sky? You think they mean the first emperor? Asked Naruto as Colin just shrugged. At any rate, Nunnally, I couldn't let that action stand, I had to act. Continued Naruto, turning back to Nunnally, who had a troubled look upon her brow. I know, Naruto-kun, it's just, started Nunnally as Naruto nodded. Hi, we came here for peace, I know. You know I don't want anything else, Nunnally, but I can't just let them get away with attacking one of our own either. Still, Granny Tsunade's willing to meet with us, so maybe we can make this mess turn out for the best. Breathed the blonde as Colin looked down at him, a grin spreading across her face as she looked at him. Oh, is that who you want to see? Or is it that Hyuga girl you kept sneaking glances at during the match? Asked Colin, causing Naruto to falter slightly as both girls leaned forward, spotting the small blush touching Naruto's cheeks as he tried to look away. I don't know what you're talking about, spoke the boy as both girls found their grins widening. Really, Naruto-kun? Asked Nunnally innocently as Naruto turned back to her, his mouth opening as he looked into her innocent face for a few moments before his head dropped in surrender. Okay, maybe I was, a little, muttered the blonde as the two girls grinned all the more. Oh, I can't wait till CC hears about this, chuckled Colin as the three moved out to prepare for the coming meeting. Less than an hour later found Naruto, Colin and Nunnally waiting inside the loading bay of their ship, watching as a pair of armored guards escorted the group from Konoha into the ship, as they looked around curiously at the inside of the machine before their eyes shifted down to focus on the figures before them. Greetings, Hokage. If you and your companions will follow me, spoke Naruto, turning to lead them into a large meeting room in the center of the ship, doubling as an observation deck so that the roof was a large glassed-in dome open to the sky above. As the group entered, they found themselves at a large central table, Naruto along with Colin and Nunnally moving to one end, while a few guards took station around the edges of the room, watching as the Konoha group settled themselves down. Thank you again for meeting with us, Emperor. I apologize again for my shinobi's actions. Is your companion all right? Asked Tsunade from across the table as Naruto felt a smile touch his lips under his helm. I accept your apology, Lady Hokage, and thank you for your concern. Yes, she is well, only tired from the tournament. If I might ask, how is the state of her first opponent? I believe his name was Choji. Replied Naruto, seeing a small look of surprise on the Konoha shinobi's faces before Tsunade replied. Oh, he will be all right. The bones had to be reset, but nothing was too severe. Replied the blonde as beside him Nunnally let a small smile touch her lips. I am glad to hear it. It was not our intention to harm your forces, only to receive the recognition of our empire. I am sure you have heard of our failed attempts to meet with your daimyos by now. Asked Naruto as Tsunade nodded. So that's what this was. They were looking to be taken seriously. Well, they got that in spades now, don't they? Thought the cage as she looked around the room they sat in. I must say this ship alone seems capable of that. On top of that, your own armaments, I would expect you to have people clamoring to trade with you now, remarked Tsunade as Naruto let out a sigh. I expect as much as well. However, weapons in our ships are not on the table, such things will remain in the West. Spoke Naruto, drawing a confused look from the Konoha forces. But why? I mean, your mastery of seals alone would put most villages to shame. Why not use that to your advantage? Asked Kushina, drawing Naruto's eyes around to her. Because such weapons are only good for war, and the West has had enough of that. At the time we are strong enough to protect ourselves, giving weapons to those who could turn them on us is not something we are looking to do. replied Naruto as the redhead found it impossible to argue with the man's observations even as the bundle in her arms let out a small happy giggle drawing a smile from Nunnally that did not go unnoticed to the mother. You know you can come and say hi, called Kushina as Nunnally turned her sparkling eyes to Naruto who gave a sigh before nodding as Colin moved to wheel the girl to Kushina where she greeted the little bundle of joy. Well, they seem to have the right idea, Hokage-sama. It is obvious that we won't be making agreements today. Instead, what do you say to simply learning of each other? I offer you to observe our ship in the hopes that we can become allies in the future. Called Naruto rising to his feet as across from him Tsunade did likewise nodding. Thank you Emperor, I believe that is for the best. Replied the blonde woman as she moved over to meet with Nunnally who was now happily holding Menma who grabbed at her long blonde hair. Minato himself soon moved over striking up a conversation with Colin on her storage ceiling, complimenting her use of it in battle, as she recounted a few stories for him creating a nice back and forth between the pair. Outside of this group Hinata turned to see the Emperor moving slowly away her eyes shifting between the group behind her and back to his departing form before moving after him. Well chapter 4 hope you are enjoying the story so far. I'll try and hit a few points here that I can see people wondering about. Before that though thank you to everyone who followed, favorite, and reviewed I really appreciate it. Okay well yes a few people are alive that weren't in canon really the war with Akatsuki was just more drawn out, but also less successful as without Naruto they never really had a hope of pulling it off at all. So instead I had the group turn in on itself like most groups with a lot of backstabbing in play due and that leading to their downfall along with the Shinobi Alliance scoring major victories over them. Soyasum like Asuma and Neji didn't die or were just lucky to be revived by pain so it all comes down to the same thing in the end. Okay to repeat, the idea of the West is ceiling and tech-based. Things like Eve's storm cannons, at least that small, are really rare at the time, most if any are more like a backpack and cannon like in Straight Jacket, and are still being worked out. The basic idea is that you seal the power and chakra into a scroll that then changes it into an element, load the scroll like a shell into the cannon and fire it off kind of like how Sasori did it with his puppet, same concept just a little less powerful on the wider scale. Also as awesome as the armor is, it isn't invincible. That attack from Sasuke could have killed Eve if it had hit her in the right spot after a full day of combat drained the seals, probably would have taken more than one but it could get to her if it hit a weak point. Also weapons are still effective as they bypass the ceiling and are only fighting the armor, which is why the West still favors blades and kunai launchers. Oh and for a chakra cannon, well look at Straight Jacket anime gun, main character gun to get an idea of what that looks like. Hope that helps and remember looking for people for Euphemia and Cornelia, enjoy the chapter and thanks for reading. Small bit, but FYI yes Pain and the Akatsuki are dead and gone, with Konan Shi's in Rain leading it. Honestly as they don't factor into the big story I just kind of left them out but there you go if you were curious about that. Oh and to the guest who asked why Naruto's sibling is a boy, well cause I wanted it to be. If you want the sister thing take a look at my other stories, I think I've made like 6 younger sister OCs by now lol. Also I would like to say if you haven't read the Empire story by Devil ZX Knight 86 then you really should. He made a really unique story that helped inspire me to make my own story and take it in a new direction as well. So check his out and support a great writer. Chapter 4. Talking, Thinking, Mental Conversation. Demon, God or the like, printed words. Jutsu. For the sake of peace. As the armored emperor turned from the observatory his path took him down a corridor and out onto the top of the ship the desert air rushing over him blowing the burnt orange cloak and tail plumb out behind him as he moved towards the railing his eyes scanning the tranquil scene before him, even as his mind stormed with old memories. As Naruto looked out at the desert his thoughts turned to the last time he had made his was across the wasteland. Well, I guess this time I made it to Suna, that's something, and Gaara made Kazekage, he looked happy, and the people seemed to love him too. I'm sorry I didn't get to see that happen, not that it would have happened in Konoha I suppose. Thought the blonde, shaking himself from such thoughts even as he heard a small movement behind him. Turning back, Naruto found himself watching as Hinata stepped out onto the deck, the desert wind catching her blue hair, blowing it out in a gentle wave, as she raised on delicate hand to keep it from covering her sight. As Naruto saw her like that, the sun reflecting off of her pale skin, her hair flying in the wind, his mind seemed to simply fail him. As Hinata managed to brush her hair aside, she looked up to see the Emperor standing before her, his cloak pulled back to show the red armor below, making him appear like some living machine of war rather than human. However, for some reason, even under such a man's gaze, she didn't feel afraid. Somehow she could just tell that he meant her no harm. "Excuse me, Emperor," spoke the girl, causing Naruto to snap himself out of his momentary stupor, his helm turning fully to face her as he found himself looking straight into her pale lavender eyes. "Wah. Oh. Hello, Lady Hinata," managed Naruto, mentally smacking himself for spacing out like he had. Hinata for her part seemed to be kind enough not to press the matter, instead nodding in reply before continuing. "Hi. My name is Hinata Hyuga, Emperor. I hope you don't mind me joining you," spoke Hinata as Naruto felt himself relaxing at the sound of her voice. "I don't mind, Lady Hinata," replied Naruto as Hinata moved over to look out over the desert, a calm expression moving across her face as her eyes passed over the dunes. "It really is lovely," she whispered as Naruto found himself chuckling softly, drawing a confused look from Hinata as he did. "Sorry, I wasn't laughing at you. I just had occasion to cross a desert on foot once, and I have to say lovely isn't exactly what springs to mind anymore," chuckled Naruto as Hinata found herself smiling, slightly nodding. "Hi, I suppose some places can lose their beauty if something like that happens," replied Hinata, sparking Naruto's interest with her words. "Oh, you sound like you have experience in that. Crossed any deserts lately?" asked Naruto with a light-hearted tone that caused Hinata to let out a soft, warm chuckle of her own. "Wow, what a cute laugh. No, stop it, Naruto, no arrow thoughts bad. Bad Kurama did not turn you into a pervert," Naruto mentally yelled as he turned his focus back to the woman standing beside him. "No, nothing like that. My home just isn't the same place anymore," whispered the girl as Naruto sighed. "The war?" asked Naruto as Hinata shook her head slowly. "No. Well, yes, the war was hard, but it happened long before the war," replied Hinata, her mind drifting to a smiling blonde face. "Naruto, wait, why am I talking to him about this? I mean, he does seem nice, and that voice, but no, bad Hinata," thought the girl, shaking herself even as touches of red found their way to her cheeks, privately cursing Kushina for always teasing her about her crush on her son. "I see. I'm sorry to hear that. Someone as pretty as you should have things make you smile more," replied Naruto before he froze, only just realizing what he had let slip, even as under his helm he flushed a brighter crimson than even Colin's armor. Across from him, Hinata was doing her own imitation, as Naruto found himself panicking, slightly raising his hands in a slightly defensive manner. "No, I'm sorry, that was wrong to say. I mean, not that you aren't pretty, you're beautiful, it just, sorry," came the stream of words from the man, obviously flustered as Hinata felt a small giggle starting. "Is that why you were watching me during the matches?" asked Hinata in some amusement as the armored figure looked away from her, suddenly embarrassed, obvious even through his armored form, causing her giggling to blossom into a deep, rich laugh as she saw the armored titan in such a position. Soon enough, Naruto found himself starting to laugh as well, till both of the pair were allowing their amusement to sound across the sandy dunes. It took the pair a good few minutes to finally quiet themselves down, leaving both panting, slightly resting against the railings. Hinata's smiling face turned up to Naruto's helm as a few stray chuckles continued to slip out. Thank you, Lady Hinata. I needed that," spoke Naruto, the happiness of his laugh still upon his words as beside him Hinata nodded, smiling. "There's no need, Emperor. I'm happy to know I hadn't offended you. Smiled Hinata as she looked up at his towering form, finding herself completely at ease with this man. I don't think you could offend anyone, Lady Hinata, but I do apologize if I worried you. Spoke Naruto, finally gaining control of his laughter as Hinata shook her head. No apology necessary. Though I suppose I should get back to the Hokage. Spoke Hinata as Naruto stepped back from the railing, holding a hand out to her. Well then, may I escort you? Asked Naruto happily as Hinata felt another twinge of a blush as she gently placed her hand into the gauntlet of Naruto's, feeling a slight warmth to it as she did. I would be happy if you would. Replied Hinata as the two turned, moving back towards the bowels of the ship. Soon enough, Naruto and Hinata found themselves stepping out into the observation deck, both pausing at what oddness that they saw playing out. On one side of the room, Tsunade and Shizune both stood beside the chair-bound Nunnally with little Menma in her lap, clapping happily as his violet eyes looked across the room to where Minato was caught in between Colin and Kushina, looking as though he wanted to simply melt through the floor. Kushina, I promise we were just talking about seals. Called Minato in a slight whimper as Kushina shot him an annoyed look before turning to Colin, who was giving her a challenging smirk. What? You want to go around tomato? Called Colin as Kushina stepped forwards, her teeth grinding as her hair parted into 9 waving strands. What did you call me, you little red crab? Called back Kushina as Colin turned red, glaring back at Kushina, her blue eyes blazing angrily as well. What did you call me? Yelled Colin as Kushina gave her a dangerous smile. Crab, crab, crab. Shot back Kushina as Colin turned almost as red as her hair in anger. Stupid tomato. Threw Colin as the two redhead moved closer, even as Minato shrank between them, letting out a small pathetic whimper as he did. Are we interrupting something? Called Naruto as the group turned to him, Minato letting out a little meep for help, as Naruto made his way forwards. Shaking his head as he looked over at Nunnally and Tsunade, both of whom waved over at the redheads. Sighing, Naruto made his way over, stepping between the two, separating them. I will have to ask you both to try and not start a conflict aboard the ship. Colin, keep this up and I'm putting Cornelia back in charge of your training. Called Naruto, causing Colin to give a slightly worried look before allowing her anger to vanish, stepping back as Kushina let out a small huff of pride, smiling over at Tsunade, who shook her head, not meeting the woman's gaze. Thank you, whispered Minato, causing Naruto to turn to face the blonde, letting out a small chuckle. Don't mention it, I've been where you are a few times, except mine had pink hair. Commented Naruto, thinking back to the disagreements between Euphemia and Cornelia when the youngest wanted to join the war. Private fights aside, I think it is time that we depart. Our forces are waiting for us before we return to Konoha. Thank you for your hospitality, Emperor. Spoke Tsunade as she moved forward with Nunnally, who handed the bundle to Kushina, who smiled down at the girl with a few words of thanks. I see. I do hope that we will have opportunities for future interactions, Lady Hokage. Replied Naruto as the Konoha group began to gather. As Hinata passed him, Naruto felt a small tug in his chest, the words finding themselves to his lips before his mind had a say in them. Oh, and Lady Hinata, I would like to see you again if possible. Called Naruto as everyone suddenly turned to Hinata, who grew a small blush, looking around at everyone's eyes before bowing her head quickly, her bangs hiding her face. Hi, I would enjoy that, Emperor. Excuse me. She managed before turning to move ahead of the Konoha group, who looked back at the Emperor for a moment before following after her, leaving Naruto to receive knowing smirks from both Colin and Nunnally. Meanwhile, at the base of the ship, Hinata had already moved a few feet away, still blushing madly before the rest of the party reached her. Well, Hinata-chan, what was that about? Asked Tsunade as Hinata, still blushing, looked away only to find Kushina grinning at her with little Menma mimicking his mother looking up at the girl. Well? Asked Kushina as Hinata suddenly became very interested in her own feet. We just talked. Whispered Hinata as Minato let out a small chuckle. Must have been quite a talk. After all, he seemed very interested in getting to know you, Hinata. Smiled the blonde as Hinata nodded slightly. I suppose that at least makes it easy to know who to send as our representative. Spoke Tsunade, looking over to Shizune, who nodded even as Hinata looked up at the pair. So you decided to take them up on the offer? Asked Minato as Tsunade turned to her fellow blonde, sighing slightly. Hi, I know the village is likely to throw a fit about the Uchiha, but the United West seems willing to open their arms to us, and I'm not going to throw that chance away. Besides, I honestly can't see someone who works with Lady Nunnally being someone to turn on their word. Continued Tsunade as Kushina nodded. Little Menma seemed to like her, and I have to say her chakra may have been immense, but it was gentle. I doubt she could hurt a fly. Remarked the redhead as Shizune let out a small chuckle. Unlike you, it would appear. Really, Kushina, you and Lady Colin could be mistaken for family. Spoke the raven-haired woman, drawing a small chuckle from Kushina as she idly scratched her head in embarrassment. Yeah, sorry about that, you know. Spoke the redhead, drawing a few chuckles as the group made their way back into Suna. A day after the forces of Konoha had departed, the crew of the airship were looking over final preparations for their return flight following a final meeting with the Cage to settle a date to meet with the Daimyo of Wind. Currently, a few final preparations were underway as Naruto and Nunnally found themselves standing on top of the ship, giving the walls of Suna a final parting look before they took off. It really is a beautiful city. Whispered Nunnally as Naruto nodded. Hi. And it has a great ruler. Gaara will look after it. Smiled Naruto as the girl nodded. I'm sure he will. You know, he spoke very highly of you in our last meeting, Naruto. I'm sure he would be happy to see you for you. Spoke the girl, looking up to see Naruto nodding, letting out a small sigh. He probably would, but that would force him to lie for me, and I won't do that to him. Maybe after our treaties are in place and everything is settled, I can risk it. But till then, I won't be seen as the Emperor of the West, just a cast-out fox. Replied Naruto as Nunnally nodded sadly. I'm sorry, Naruto-kun. Whispered the girl as Naruto laid a hand gently upon her shoulder, shaking his head down at her. Don't worry, Nunnally. I'm alright. Spoke Naruto as the girl gave a soft smile. I wonder if that has anything to do with Hinata. Offered the girl as Naruto sighed, shrugging as he looked out. Not going to get away from that one, am I? Asked Naruto, seeing the girl shake her head slightly with a knowing smile. It's like I told you, I don't know, she was one of the few who was really nice to me back in Konoha, and she hasn't really changed. Continued Naruto as Nunnally giggled. Oh, I think she might have changed some. Added the girl, causing Naruto to blush beneath his helm. However, before he could respond to the girl, a sudden wave of chakra caused both of them to jerk around in time to see a shorter man fly up beside their ship, his short stature and red nose identifying him as the third Tsuchikage Onoki. Hanging beside him in the air were a black-haired woman as well as a heavy-set man who focused their eyes between the two figures below them as Naruto stepped before the chair-bound girl, his helm turning towards Onoki. Tsuchikage, what may I do for you? Asked Naruto, watching as the three lowered closer to the deck, covering just above it as Onoki focused upon the Emperor. Are you the Emperor of the West, the land of sky? Asked Onoki as Naruto felt his eyes narrowing, something about this man setting him on the defensive. I am the Emperor of the United West, Tsuchikage, but I am unfamiliar with this land of sky you speak of. Replied Naruto as beside Onoki the black-haired woman scoffed. "You're right, the West was where the sky shinobi came from that tried to destroy the elemental nations. Don't feed us some crap about not being them," called the woman as Naruto turned to her, his tone becoming dangerous as he spoke. "I would be careful, Kunoichi. Insulting others is no way to endear yourself. As for Sky, our nation was divided by war until only a few years ago. The actions of one part does not reflect the whole, unless you wish me to blame you for the actions of the Uchiha at the tournament," called Naruto, causing the girl to scowl. However, before she could reply, Onoki raised a hand to silence her as he turned to face Naruto, a small smirk crossing his lips. "You have no love for Konoha. That is good, it means we have something in common. I am here to discuss trade between our nations," called the old man as Naruto nodded. "And what, may I ask, is it you want from my nation?" asked Naruto as the old man's smirk grew into a smile. "A few of those armors would be a good place to start," stated Onoki as Naruto watched him. "I see," replied Naruto as Onoki nodded. "Good, we understand each other. From that started the man before Naruto cut him off. "I'm afraid then we will not be able to trade with your land. The weapons of the West will not be brought to the East," stated Naruto, getting a scowl from both Onoki and his guards as the Kunoichi spoke again. "What? Why? You came here to show off your weapons and then don't want to sell them? What kind of sense does that make?" called the woman as Naruto shook his head. "We came to be taken seriously, Kunoichi, not to barter or trade death. Our nation wishes for only peaceful trade, but our weapons will not be among them," Naruto flatly stated as the Tsuchikage glared down at the armored lord. "Came to be taken seriously, huh? Maybe it is you who is not taking us seriously, Emperor," called Onoki, allowing an orb of white light to slowly gather around his palm, the slight vibration of his dust release forming as he looked down to see Nunnely's eyes widening in horror as beside her Naruto stiffened. "That's right, you fools. I won't let Iowa be surpassed by this piece. Konoha has the return of the fourth, and the fox is still missing. Like I am a large enough fool to believe that. Iowa needs an edge and no fool of an emperor will stand in my way," thought the old man, slowly raising his hand to point palm out towards the stadium. Both Naruto and Nunnally turned horrified towards the stadium, both recognizing that thing in the old man's hands. They should, after all, it was what had haunted Nunnally's nightmares since the war, her power. "What are you doing? There could be people there," yelled Nunnally in fear as the old man only smirked down at her. "Too bad for them then," remarked the old man, privately smirking, knowing the arena to already be abandoned. After all, he had requested the right to demolish the temporary structure just that day from the cage under the presence of goodwill. But to both Naruto and Nunnally, this man was willing to throw lives away on just a whim. As they watched the small orb expanded before rushing forwards towards the stadium, as on the ship, Nunnally cried out in fear, throwing out her hands towards the attack. There was a deafening roar of force as the Tsuchikage and his fellows found themselves thrown back, staggering in midair, their heads rising, utterly disbelieving at what was before them. From that little wheelchair-bound girl had flown a wave of light and force that dwarfed Onoki's own by tenfold. Looking on in horror, the cage watched as his own blast was swallowed whole before the girl's own shot up into the skies, blasting a hole clear through the clouds above, scattering them to nothing. Before the members of Iowa could even comprehend this, there was a sound of hurried footsteps as armored figures rushed onto the deck, Colin at the lead, looking around before rushing to Nunnally and Naruto as the soldiers turned, bringing kunai launchers to bear on the three flying figures, putting themselves between the Emperor and the shinobi. Nunnally, for her part, was panting and shaking as she pulled her arms close to her body, exhausted from the force of the blast she had levied. As Colin turned from the shivering girl to Naruto, she saw the red cloak of chakra leaking off of him as he turned to her. "Colin, get Nunnally inside and lift off now," stated Naruto as Colin felt a small shiver run down her spine before nodding as she moved the shaking girl inside, a few soldiers following as the rest parted for Naruto to step past, his helm focused on the Tsuchikage. "That was a mistake, Onoki. The Uchiha may have been a fool, but he at least was not the leader of his village. You however have no such excuse. If you ever show your face before me again to do anything but beg my forgiveness, your village will need to find your replacement. Finished Naruto, receiving a glare from the three before they shot off into the skies even as the airship began to slowly rise before turning back towards the west. A week later found the group from Suna returning to Konoha, a storm of rumors spreading as the injured Sasuke entered the village. Soon enough rumors turned to facts of the West spreading throughout the village, many calling for some kind of action to pay them back for injuring their shinobi, most ignoring the fact that it was a lawful tournament, and preferring to simply call for action. Even among the shinobi things were tense, as most of the clan heads were unimpressed to find their children returning in defeat to an unknown force that apparently hailed from their ancient enemy's land. As a result, it was little wonder that less than a week after the group's return that Tsunade found herself facing the entire council, rubbing her head in frustration as she glanced around at them. For that last time, Danzo, no. Hostile action will not be undertaken by Konoha. Have you forgotten that we are currently at peace with the other nations? Starting a conflict like this could damage us beyond repair. Called the Hokage as Danzo scoffed. You say that, but these forces of the West are obviously a match to our own, and have already severely injured one of our strongest warriors. Called Danzo as a few mutters of agreement broke out around him before Tsunade silenced it by crashing a fist into the podium. Enough. It was a legal action under the terms of the tournament. Sasuke attempted to kill his opponent after the match was concluded, or are you saying that you would have let one of the other villages kill our shinobi in such a manner without acting? Called Tsunade as a few more mutters began, though now they seemed in agreement with Tsunade on this point at least. Even still, the West presents an issue that we can't simply ignore. Stated the blonde Inoichi, drawing a few nods from his fellows as Tsunade groaned, rubbing at her head praying for patience. They will not be ignored, Inoichi. I have already met with the Emperor after the tournament, and was able to receive forgiveness for Sasuke's actions. I have also been granted permission to send an ambassador to the west from our village to possibly open up trade with them. Continued Tsunade as a few nodded around. Really? I have to say I wouldn't mind having some of that armor if it's as impressive as I've heard. Called Sum, a few voices speaking agreements as Tsunade sighed, bracing for what came next. You can forget about that, Sum. The West already informed me that weapons trade was not on the table. Stated Tsunade as the voices erupted again, grumbling about what to do about the situation until a blast of killing intent rocked the room, causing the council to fall silent once again. Enough. This matter is closed. Konoha's ambassador will be leaving for the West by day's end. Called the blonde as she turned from the podium, leaving the arguing group behind as she headed back to her office, Shizune falling in behind her. As the pair opened the door to the Hokage's office, it was to find a white-haired man sitting astride the windowsill, giving a small wave of greeting to the pair, grinning at their arrival. Hello, Haim. Called Jiraiya in a happy tone as Tsunade shot him an annoyed look before shutting the door, moving over to her desk, glance over at the sage as she reached it. What do you want, Jiraiya? Called the woman, in no mood for games as her old teammate raised his hands defensively. Hey, don't shoot, I just came after I heard about the tournament and this united West. Replied Jiraiya as Tsunade glared at him. That is none of your concern. Your job is to find Naruto. Shot Tsunade as Jiraiya dropped his arms, his face adopting a tired expression. Tsunade, you know that he's already dia, started Jiraiya before Tsunade cut him off. Don't you dare say that. If he was dead we would know by now. Hell, the whole world would know by now, cause the Kyuubi would be running around causing hell again. Spat back Tsunade as Jiraiya sighed. Tsunade, that seal could have taken the fox with him and you know it, Either that or Akatsuki found him, sending me chasing ghosts is a waste. I could be of use checking out this United. Started Jiraiya before he was forced to duck as a jug of sake flew past his head. Don't you call him a waste. Now get the hell out of here before I finish what Minato started. You bastard, if you'd done your job as a godfather he'd still be here. Spat Tsunade as Jiraiya gave her a harsh look before disappearing from the windowsill, leaving Tsunade glaring after him for a few moments before dropping back into her chair, looking over to Shizune who was watching her concerned. I'm alright, just tired, assured the woman as she plopped down into her chair, drawing in a deep breath as she looked down at the files before her. Shizune, go ahead and bring Hinata here, will you? Asked the blonde as her raven-haired assistant nodded, disappearing in a swirl of leaves a moment later. Soon enough Shizune had returned with Hinata in tow, Tsunade looking up from the desk offering the pair a small smile. Hello Hinata, are you ready for your trip? Asked Tsunade as the pale-eyed girl nodded. Hi Lady Tsunade, replied Hinata as the Hokage nodded. Good, now this. Here Tsunade pulled up a scroll given to her by Nunnally should they wish to contact them, contains a seal to signal your arrival in Suna. Once you arrive simply apply chakra and a ship will arrive within a day to retrieve you. The terms were for only one, so I am afraid your team will have to separate from you in Suna. Your mission is to represent the best of Konoha, and hopefully open up possibilities with the Empire. Finished Tsunade as Hinata stepped forwards, nodding as she took the scroll. O course Lady Tsunade, I will do my best. Replied Hinata, drawing a small smile from the blonde. I'm sure you will, and try not to get too friendly with their emperor in the meantime. Hiyashi would throw a fit if his daughter came back with an armored baby in her arms. Teased the Hokage as Hinata fought back a small blush before bowing herself out. As she departed, Shizune gave her lady a small disapproving look. Was that necessary? She asked as Tsunade grinned back at her. Oh, entirely. Besides, I haven't seen her act like that since he left. It's good for her. Whispered Tsunade before she looked back to her work, pulling out a scroll that had arrived just the morning. As her eyes scanned down the paper, she felt her head throbbing again before she set it back on the table, reaching for a bottle again. Lady Tsunade? Asked Shizune, seeing the irritation upon her master brow. It looks like the United West made more of a splash than we thought. There's a call for a full meeting of the Alliance to discuss them to meet in Iron a few days from now. Spoke Tsunade before taking a swig of sake, turning to look out across the village, sighing to herself as her eyes moved across it. Let's hope they're more reasonable than this place. Thought Tsunade as she spied Team 8 moving out through the gates, Hinata at the head. While the players were starting to move in the east, back in the west the delegation from Suna had just arrived back in the capital. Even Wally bidding brief goodbyes before the champion of the Western tournament escorted her charge back to their home within the palace, looking to get some rest after their time in Suna. As Naruto, Colin and Nunnally disembarked, it was to find Lelouch, CC and Kurama along with a small group of guards ready to greet them. Sharing a brief welcome, the group soon moved into the palace to discuss the events of Suna. In no time the group found themselves in an open room decorated with tall windows, open to allow the gentle breeze in to waft gently over the long conference table, causing a few of the hanging drapes to wave softly around them. As the group moved to take their seats, Lelouch was looking between Colin and his sister Nunnally, noticing the small exhaustion plaguing his sister, his concern evident upon his brow as he turned to Naruto. What happened? Even Wally only greeted us before rushing inside, and Nunnally looks like she's seen a ghost. Stated Lelouch as beside him CC fixed Naruto with a quizzitive look, leaning forward, her fingers interlocking above the table as she watched Naruto pull his helmet free, setting it to one side with a sigh. A great deal occurred, Lelouch. I'll start at the beginning, replied Naruto before going into a full explanation of the events from the preliminary meetings with Gaara, past the tournament, and meeting with Konoha to the final confrontation, and the reason for Nunnally's condition. As Naruto reached the end of his story, Lelouch looked stricken, blinking over at his sister before reaching up to grasp his head, shivering slightly as he began to take a few gasping breaths. In response, Nunnally rushed to her sibling's side, laying her hands upon his own and drawing him closer as the teen whispered a few muffled apologies. After a moment, the purple-eyed youth managed to compose himself, turning to face Naruto as he did. Naruto, I'm sore. He started before Naruto raised a hand for silence. Don't apologize, Lelouch. The plan wasn't at fault. We assumed that the East as a whole would be opposed to conflict, and it seems they were mistaken on some accounts. However, there was still some advances, spoke Naruto as beside Lelouch his sister nodded, offering a small smile as she gripped her brother's hand tightly in her own. Hi, thanks to the cage we have a meeting with the Wind Daimyo, and Konoha has agreed to send an ambassador, spoke the girl as Lelouch nodded to her. Aside from that, we have also at least shown that we are not to be simply ignored. Eve's victory has a few of the minor nations of the East requesting audiences as well. From the messages we received before departing, the land of spring and rain were among them, spoke Naruto as across the table CC nodded, leaning back, letting out a breath it seemed she had been holding. So we have potential allies and enemies alike. I suppose this was the only really possibility. At any rate, the Empire is still in one piece. Cornelia and Euphemia are finishing their patrol of the border even now, and the new chakra cannons are finally ready, spoke CC as a small sigh drew Naruto's attention around. Ready? I thought that would take longer. I had a heart attack when you gave Cornelia one of those things. Honestly, now she can shoot fire, muttered the fox, drawing a small smile to the table's collective faces. That bad? Asked Naruto as the fox shivered. That woman terrifies me, muttered the fox before dropping down from the table and walking away, his 9 tails waving lazily behind him as he slipped out of the room. So is there anything else we should be informed about? I have a bad feeling about Iowa, but as only part of the alliance I think we are safe from any action for now. Though I would like a chance to pay that midget back, spoke Lelouch, his voice returning to his usual steady tone as Naruto shook his head. No, nothing, started Naruto before Nunnally cut him off with a small giggle. Oh, there was Hinata, commented the girl, drawing a confused look from the table as Naruto suddenly looked incredibly uncomfortable. Hinata? Nunnally, what are you talking about? Asked Lelouch as CC suddenly turned to Naruto, giving him an absolutely wicked-looking smile. Hinata? Wasn't that the name of the girl you knew back in Konoha? Oh Naruto, don't tell me you've lost your innocence the first time I let you out of my sight, chuckled CC as Naruto along turned beet red, drawing a stream of giggles from both CC as well as Nunnally. Wah! No, I just spoke with her, Naruto called, and invited her to see you again, added Nunnally as Naruto turned wide-eyed to her only to hear Colin speak up. Oh, and can't forget you and her having that private time on the roof of the ship, pointed out the redhead as Naruto finally gave up, laying his head upon the table and listening to the laughter of the group till it finally died down. Lifting his head up slightly, Naruto looked across at the group. Are you done? He asked as the group nodded, causing him to sit back up with a small sigh. Okay, well, that's everything. Lelouch, go ahead and send a message to Cornelia and Euphemia on what occurred, and keep the Second Fleet on alert along the border. I don't want to leave ourselves open if the East is foolish enough to try something, finished Naruto as the table at large nodded, moving away until only CC and he sat across from one another, the green-haired woman brushing a few stray hairs from her face as she fixed the blonde boy with her yellow eyes. You know, you were so worried about Nunnally and Eve, you forgot to be concerned about yourself. How are you dealing with what you saw in the East? Asked CC, watching as Naruto paused before he seemed to deflate slightly in his chair. Slowly the emperor's eyes turned out towards the tall windows that stretched from floor to ceiling, his gaze drifting over the gardens outside as he allowed his mind to wander. I suppose I just felt sad. Most of the people there I could care less about, but a few I would have really liked to have talked to as myself. Replied Naruto as Cece nodded, pushing herself up from her seat and moving past Naruto, lightly ruffling his hair as she did. Well then, I suppose you'll just have to make sure we become allies so you can give them a proper greeting. Till then, tell me more about this Hinata. Chuckled Cece as Naruto turned to her with an annoyed look that only made her laugh all the more. At the same time, across the empire along the border, Cornelia was moving through a fortress in full armor, calling out orders as soldiers rushed here and there to follow. Soon enough, the purple-haired woman found herself out on the firing range, watching as a few soldiers moved forward, their reinforced armor glinting slightly in the light as they strapped heavy-looking crates onto their back before hefting up oversized slabs of iron. The slabs were an elongated rectangle that bowed out into a harsh point that then curved back, housing a single large handle in the rear, as along the side a support handle that acted as both supports stood out just short of half the length of weapon. As Cornelia watched, one soldier hefted the massive cannon up, staggering slightly as he started to fall back, only to find Cornelia catching the cannon in one hand, giving him a disapproving look. "Soldier, explain yourself," ordered the woman as the man steadied himself, snapping to attention as he hefted his cannon to up beside himself. "Hi, my apologies, I am not used to the weight," called the man as Cornelia let out a grunt, reaching forwards to pull the cannon from his grip, swinging the weapon around with one hand by the support trigger, leveling it down range as she hit the engage. There was a small hum as seals lit up along the rear pack, small sparks of light shimmering around the cannon before, with a thunderclap of sound, a blast of fire, around the size of a refrigerator, rocketed forward, smashing into a target down range, causing it to explode into flames. With a small huff, Cornelia tossed the cannon back into the man, arms turning from him. "Then get stronger," called the woman as she moved away, the man looking from the cannon in his arms to the retreating form of Cornelia as he snapped out a salute even as the woman moved further into the base. "Oh oh 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 A few days later, on the other side of the continent within the land of iron, Tsunade was moving into a miniature amphitheater-like room where a semicircular table stood in the center, where several figures already sat looking up at the blonde as she entered the room. Tsunade turned, giving Gaara and a small nods before moving over to her seat, glancing up as a red-haired woman walking in her generous form covered by a blue kimono, a cage hat, identifying her as the current Mizukage Mei. With a few nods, she too moved to find her seat, even as the final member Onoki arrived just as an aged-looking samurai moved into the room, taking a seat across from the group, his black eyes traveling around the room briefly before nodding to the guards who moved to seal the doors, cutting the room off from outside interference. As the massive iron doors snapped shut, the head of the samurai's Mifune cast his gaze around once more before speaking out in a heavy tone that did not beg to be questioned in the least. "Very well, cages of the great hidden villages, we have gathered here under the request of the current Tsuchikage to address the matter of the Land of Sky, or as they are now known, the United Empire of the West," finished the man, nodding his bandaged head towards Onoki's squat figure. "I will skip the formalities. The West is a danger to the elemental nations, and I am calling for immediate action be taken," called the man, drawing more than a few odd looks as Mei let out a small disbelieving chuckle. "Really? A few losses in a tournament and you call for war? I was not aware your pride was so easily tarnished," mocked Mei, drawing a small snarl from the old man as he turned to face her. "My pride has nothing to do with this. The last time Sky was seen in these lands, they attempted to wipe out every village, and from what they displayed in the tournament, they are more dangerous than ever, possibly more than Akatsuki ever was," continued the man as it gave a small groan. "I find that hard to believe. though I would like to know how they came to possess the storm bloodline. Still, a few armored warriors is hardly worth such action. My own village received a request for an alliance with them. Stated as across from him. Gaara nodded in turn. As did my own. They hardly seem like an invading force to me, spoke Gaara as the Tsuchikage turned to him. And tell me, what have they offered in trade him? They arrive at a contest of arms to show their prowess in war and then request for alliances. Called the man, causing the group to pause for a moment. I personally met with the emperor and his fellows, and they informed me that they simply desired to be acknowledged, as their first attempts to meet with our nation's leaders was unsuccessful. Called the blonde Hokage as a frowned. I have heard the same, however from what I found it was only a single delegation traveling as any might that made the request. If they had really wanted recognition, why not simply use one of their airships? The daimyos would have met with them for that alone. Spoke the muscled man as beside him May nodded. Hi, that is true, and it cannot be denied that the tournament could be seen as a show of force to help with Theses treaties they speak of. Added May as Tsunade sighed. I hardly think so. Neither the emperor nor Lady Nunnally gave off the impression of using such underhanded tactics. I would almost go as far to say they seemed innocent of such things. Remarked the Hokage, already annoyed that she was forced to deal with the same mistrust here as back in her own village. The same emperor that shattered our greatest barrier as though it was paper and crushed one of our greatest warrior hand you call innocent? Asked a more than a bit skeptical. Add on to that his guards were able to not only push my brother B back in a fair fight, and the other took the tournament, it stands to reason he is at least their strength. I would hardly call that innocent. Continued A as beside him the shortest Kage nodded before speaking. And as for that girl, she is possibly stronger than even him, spoke the man, drawing several exasperated looks. Now you are being ridiculous, spoke Tsunade as Onoki turned to Gaara. Kage, what happened the day after the tournament outside of Suna? Called the man as Gaara looked at him curiously before speaking. You caused a small panic by discharging your dust release into the sky beside my village Tsuchikage, though the display itself was more than impressive. Had you been capable of that during the war, it is a wonder it took as long as it did. Remarked the red-headed boy as May looked over to him. Oh, so the old man was showing off? Asked the woman as Gaara nodded. Hi, or at least that is what I call blasting enough chakra to have wiped out a village into the skies, ripping apart the clouds. Replied Gaara as the table looked to Onoki, who was frowning. That wasn't me, spoke the man, drawing confused looks. It was your dust release, wasn't it? Stated Gaara as the old man turned to Tsunade. No, it was that innocent girl of yours that displayed that power. Replied the man as everyone at the table froze. Wah, what? Asked Tsunade, not believing his words as the old man nodded. Hi, that innocent little girl displayed enough power in one attack to wipe a village clear from the earth, turning everything inside of it to dust if she wished, so tell me again that I'm overreacting. Finished the man, turning to address the other cages, all of whom now looked shaken by this news. Troubling, if they have that much power then. Started May as a finished her thought for her. Then if they decide to invade, we may not be capable of stopping them. Spoke the man, leaning back looking across to Gaara, who was now deep in thought. That doesn't mean that they will act either, or that they have been anything but honest with us, pointed out Tsunade as Gaara nodded. Hi, but if they did, Suna would be the first place to fall. This deserves careful thought. Replied the redhead. I have already sent an ambassador to the United West to discuss a treaty. Are you suggesting we make a move that could jeopardize that over a suspicion? Called Tsunade, thinking of Hinata as a side. It is not only about Konoha Hokage. At the very least, I do not like being on the weaker side of this bargaining table. Muttered a, looking around and receiving nods from May and Onoki. Seeing this, Tsunade turned to Gaara, seeing him let out a breath before nodding as well. I do not wish for conflict either, however the risk is too great to assume otherwise. At the very least we must show that we are not a weak nation. Spoke Gaara as a nodded. Hi, But full war is also too much, as the Hokage has said this could be unfounded fears. Finished A. Well then the answer seems to be to put ourselves into a better position of power before meeting with the West again. I suppose you had some idea of this Tsuchikage? Asked Mei as the old man nodded. My forces have identified a small base on the border of Suna's land. It is close enough for a dispute of the territory to be genuine. I suggest we take the base with a united assault, capture the forces there before demanding a meeting with the West. Stated the man as Tsunade growled at him. What? You want to attack them? Are you mad? How could that not be an act of war? Called the woman as Gaara nodded. I agree, this seems too bold. Added the redhead. Perhaps, but with our forces there is no need for an actual fight to take place. Send in a small elite force to capture and incapacitate the fortress. If the risk is genuine, we have a foothold and prisoners to exchange for your ambassadors Hokage, and if they are sincere it will not be a large enough incident to cause a full war, and we will have shown we are not easily led. Finished the woman as the cages around Tsunade nodded, looking to her. Well Hokage, will you stand with or against us? Asked Onoki, smiling at her as the blonde glared back at him. Damn you, fine, I just pray you know what you are doing. Spoke Tsunade as she pushed herself from the table, feeling dirty as she left the room to prepare her own forces for what she hoped was not the greatest mistake of her life. A few days after the meeting in Iron, an airship was dipping down over the capital city of the empire, a pale-eyed girl looking out in wonder at the landscape of rooftops that stretched out below her, seeming to continue on forever. Even as she watched, the brightly colored roofs finally gave way to lush gardens as the ship took a final turn, moving down to a large open area where she spotted a small contingent of figures standing around a familiar armored figure. Soon enough, Hinata found herself being led down the rear of the ship as she stepped out onto the palace's airfield, a few ships standing around the one she was exiting. As her eyes turned forward, she saw the group moving toward her. Several white armor-clad figures with bright red splashes of color over their glimmering armor, sporting blades, as well as what appeared to be some kind of metal flaps on their backs like the wings of a beetle. However, what drew her attention the most was the armored figure in the center, his burnt red robes waving gently even as a familiar fox plum helm turned towards her, nodding as she approached. Greetings, Lady Hinata, and welcome to the West. Spoke Naruto in a happy tone as Hinata felt a small blush touch her cheeks. Thank you, Emperor. Replied Hinata, bowing as well before a small chuckle drew her eyes around to see a green-haired woman wearing a long white dress watching her. Oh, I see what you meant, she is quite lovely. Chuckled CC, looking to Naruto with a wide smile as Naruto privately wondered why he had allowed her to come with him to greet Hinata. Because you didn't let her, she just decided to on her own. Replied his mind as Naruto shook his head, raising a hand towards CC. This is CC, Lady Hinata, my self-appointed older sister and tormentor. I'm sorry. Finished Naruto as Hinata gave a small smile, turning to CC and bowing to her as well. It is a pleasure to meet you, Lady CC, spoke Hinata as the green-haired woman waved her off. None of that lady stuff with me, please, I'm old enough as it is without adding titles to it. Added CC as Hinata nodded, smiling softly as the group slowly turned back towards the palace. As they moved forward, Hinata could hardly keep herself from gazing around at the gardens, marveling at the work there as elegant flowers wound their way through the trees and small pools, looking as though the whole thing was somehow at peace with everything around it. Noticing her gaze, Naruto found himself smiling again as he spoke. I see you appreciate the work. Wally is very proud of his gardens. Spoke Naruto as Hinata turned, blinking a few times before remembering the brown-haired boy. So he is your gardener? Asked Hinata, confused as to why such a man would be with the Emperor at a tournament, her question causing Naruto to let out a good-natured chuckle. No, he is my friend. There his is now, just watch. Spoke Naruto, pointing towards a small grove where Hinata saw the overall wearing boy sitting with a look of concentration on his face. Before Hinata could understand what he might be doing, her eyes went wide as a small bush began to sprout from before him, growing up even as beautiful lavender flowers began to open up along it till the spot he had been facing was a sea of flowers gently swaying in the breeze. Hinata watched dumbfounded as before, turning to the emperor, who nodded. Here in the West, not all chakra users are fighters. Wally does not have the temperament for such things, though his partner, I think you will agree, does. Finished Naruto as Hinata watched Eve move over to sit beside Wally, who smiled brightly up at her. Soon the group was past the gardens and moving along a carpeted hall, Hinata finding herself in that same relaxed state she had found the last time she had been with the emperor. As they walked, she found herself speaking freely with the masked man, even laughing as the woman CC added her own points, usually at the cost of the emperor himself, though he didn't seem to mind. After a short trip, Hinata found herself standing before a large wooden door, the emperor bowing to her slightly. Lady Hinata, these will be your quarter for your stay. I'll let you get settled. Please let me know if there is anything I can do to make you stay better. Finished Naruto as behind him CC smirked. Oh, I can think of a few things. She chuckled as Hinata turned red before turning to leave, Naruto rising to look after her. Sorry about that. I don't know what she is sometimes. Muttered Naruto as Hinata waved it off. It is all right. Will you be free to speak further later? Asked the pale-eyed woman as Naruto smiled behind his helm. I believe so. I look forwards to forging a lasting peace with you, Lady Hinata. Finished Naruto, nodding once more before turning down the hall, even as Hinata looked after him, smiling softly to herself as she turned to enter the room. I do to Emperor, thought the woman, as with a small blush she began to unpack, neither she nor Naruto knowing that the peace they hoped for was just a dream. Across the western land, just within their border, a restless Cornelia was making rounds within the last post on her trip, Euphemia already asleep within the headquarters, night having fallen a few hours previously. As the purple-armored woman passed another sentry, she idly shifted her helm from one hand to another, the night breeze catching the formal cape now adorning her armor, marking her as the commander of the armies. As she moved down a flight of stairs from the outer wall, her private guard fell in beside her, white armor blazing beside the dull gray and black of the standard soldiers in her own dark purple set. As the group moved over the open courtyard past a massive storage building, the woman's gaze slowly shifting to one of the watchtowers, a small flicker of movement catching her eyes. Slowly Cornelia lifted her helm, securing it upon her brow in a simple manner, as around the walls a silent force moved ever closer. Then without warning Cornelia moved, jerking her left hand forward, grabbing hold of the hilt of one of her guard's blades, drawing it in one smooth motion even as she spun back towards the tower, her arm flashing forward as the blade went spinning end over end to sink into the darkness with an audible thwack. A moment later, the body of a black-clad kunoichi fell from the tower, their white mask shattering as she impacted upon courtyard, the guard's blade buried to the hilt into her chest. To arms, warriors of the West! Cried Cornelia, drawing her own blade as around her, the guards slung kunai launchers free of their shoulders or drew blades just as a wave of shadows darted from the walls, rushing down towards them, the outer watch already having gone silent. Shit, how did she spot us? Cried a pink-haired girl, looking around to a dark-skinned man idly chewing on a stick of candy as he drew a pair of fanged blades. Does it matter? We have a job to do. Called the white-haired man as he dropped down, landing a devastating hit on one armored figure who stumbled forward, struggling to levy his kunai launcher before a blast of lightning crashed into him, drawing a yell of pain as he fell over, groaning in pain. Ah! Everyone move up, we need to hit them before they can organize, called Sakura, rushing forwards as a squad of mixed shinobi followed after her, moving down into the courtyard even as the chatter of kunai launchers and the blast of justice tore into the silent night. As the shinobi forces charged down the walls, Inside the camp, soldiers rushed out of the barracks, armor-clad and forwards to meet the invaders, full force, blades drawn. As the first crashed into the shinobi, a shower of sparks was added to the night as kunai meet blade, and elements crashed against the reinforced armor of the defenders. As she landed, Sakura watched as one of the armored figures moved forwards, leveling one of those kunai launchers, spraying fire at a pair of shinobi who rushed him, both weaving in and out of the shots, closing in on him till one swept a kick around, shattering the launcher in a spray of parts as his fellow slammed a similar blow into the man's chest, sending him staggering back a few paces but not falling. Instead, Sakura saw as the armored figure draw a sword, straight unlike the blades of the samurai, and charge the pair, sending one back